Deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains stands a structure that defies logic. 250 rooms under a single roof, 35 bedrooms, 65 fireplaces, an indoor pool carved from stone, a banquet hall whose ceiling climbs 70 feet toward heaven. Biltmore Estate consumed 6 years of construction and approximately $6 million, more than $200 million in currency you recognize today. Beautiful. Yes, but this palace was never just a house. How does one man 26 years old command enough wealth to build what resembles a French chateau transplanted to American soil? What machinery must turn beneath such beauty to keep the fantasy alive? Who actually paid for this dream, not with money alone, but with hands, with years, with futures they would never see? And here is the question that haunts every stone. If the richest family in America could barely sustain Biltmore, why has no billionaire since dared to build anything remotely similar? The answer reveals something darker than changing architectural taste. The world that made Biltmore possible was deliberately destroyed. What replaced it tells the real story of American wealth, not its disappearance, but its transformation into something harder to see, harder to measure, harder to tax. The billionaires didn't vanish. They learned to hide. If you enjoy deep explorations into the forgotten mansions and families that shaped the most extravagant era, please support this documentary by liking and subscribing. And if you have your own insights or stories about these estates, I'd love to read them. Now, let's step inside. Picture the winter of 1888. Western North Carolina holds the cold like a secret. Snow clings to ridgelines. Valleys fill with morning fog that burns away slowly, revealing forests that stretch unbroken toward horizons no road has reached. George Washington Vanderbilt, 2 steps from a train in Asheville. 26 years old, thin, bookish, uncomfortable in crowds. He speaks 8 languages, but struggles with small talk. His physicians have sent him south for his lungs' chronic respiratory trouble that follows him from New York winters. The mountain air tastes of wood smoke and pine. The town itself is modest. A few streets, wooden buildings. Nothing resembles the marble palace's lining. Fifth Avenue, where George's brothers compete to construct the most elaborate showpieces, hosting costume balls that cost fortunes and scandalize newspapers. George is different. He carries books instead of attending parties. He studies European estates the way other men study stock reports. He has inherited approximately $10 million from his father William Henry Vanderbilt, plus trust income that exceeds what most families earn in lifetimes. At 26, he possesses wealth he could never spend. But wealth without purpose feels hollow. Stand where George stood in 1888 and look outward. Mountains rise in blue-gray waves. Forests thick enough to lose yourself in. Land selling for almost nothing because the Civil War's devastation still echoes through these valleys. Families desperate. Timber companies having stripped many hillsides bare, leaving erosion and exhausted soil. George sees something no one else perceives. Not just a health retreat, not merely pretty scenery. He sees space distance from society's expectations, room to build something that would be impossible in the crowded Northeast. He sees possibility at a scale that makes his brother's mansions look like cottages. By 1889, George has acquired roughly 125,000 acres surrounding Asheville, an area larger than many eastern cities. The price was remarkably low. Landowners struggling in the post-war economy sold eagerly to the wealthy northerner offering cash. Some transactions happened so quickly that families later claimed they had understood what they were sowing, not just farms, but futures, identities, connections to land their grandparents had cleared. George hires the finest talent money can secure. Richard Morris Hunt, America's preeminent architect, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, designer of the pedestal beneath the Statue of Liberty and multiple Fifth Avenue mansions for the Vanderbilt family. Hunt understands grand scale and classical proportion. He knows how to make stone sing. Frederick Law Olmsted receives the Landscape Commission. At 67 years old, Olmsted has designed Central Park in Manhattan and parks in dozens of American cities. He pioneered the profession of landscape architecture in the United States. He's at the peak of his powers and reputation. George asks Olmsted not just to landscape around a house, but to transform 125,000 acres of cutover forest and depleted farmland into a planned landscape that would rival anything in Europe. The initial conception was modest. George spoke of a country house, a retreat. Hunt sketched comfortable plans. Olmsted proposed gardens and a working farm. Then something happened that always happens when unlimited money meets unchecked ambition. The project expanded. Hunt's drawings grew more elaborate with each revision. George wanted a library to house his growing collection, already numbering in the thousands. Guest rooms for extended visits. Entertainment spaces for occasional social obligations. Technological systems that would make the house comfortable and modern. Hunt looked toward France's Loire Valley for inspiration. The chateau of the French Renaissance combined grandeur with livability, formality with elegance. He designed a 4-story limestone structure with steeply pitched roofs, massive chimneys, and elaborate stone carving worthy of royalty. French Renaissance revival transplanted to the American South. Olmsted conceived something unprecedented. Rather than simply planting gardens around a building, he would create a managed landscape encompassing the entire property. Formal gardens would surround the residence. Beyond them, planned forests would demonstrate scientific forestry practices. A model farm would prove that modern agricultural methods could restore the region's depleted soil. The estate would be self-sufficient, producing its own food, lumber, income. Or so the dream promised. To understand why Biltmore became what it did, you must understand the Vanderbilt fortune, where it came from, how fast it grew, what it meant to be a Vanderbilt in 1888. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, died in 1877 as the richest man in America. He had built his empire on steamships and railroads, transforming transportation across the continent through ruthless efficiency and strategic vision. When he died, his estate was valued at approximately $115 million, more than the entire United States Treasury held in gold reserves at that time. One man, more wealth than the federal government? The fortune passed primarily to the Commodore's son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who proved even more capable than his father. William doubled the inheritance within 8 years through railroad expansion and management, so efficient it bordered on monopoly. When William died in 1885, he left approximately $200 million divided among his 8 children. George received roughly $10 million outright, plus substantial trust income. At 23 years old, he became wealthier than he could comprehend. But here's what the numbers don't capture. George was the youngest grandson, the scholar, the one who didn't fit. His brothers built competing mansions. His cousins threw parties that made newspapers nationwide. The family name meant power, excess, ambition turned architectural. George wanted something different, something lasting, something that would matter beyond newspaper headlines and society page gossip. He wanted to create. Construction began in 1889. Ground breaks in July. A private railroad spur is built directly to the construction site to transport materials. Everything arrives by rail limestone quarried in Indiana and shipped south. Craftsmen recruited from across America and Europe. Tools and supplies in quantities that make local suppliers unable to comprehend the scale. At peak activity, more than 1,000 workers labor on the house and ground simultaneously. The scale defies anything previously attempted by a private individual in America. The foundations require excavating into bedrock. The steel structural frame is engineered to support stone walls 4 feet thick at the base. The roof covers more than an acre. Every system is designed for permanence, as though the house will stand not for decades, but for centuries. George visits the site regularly during construction, making decisions on details that range from stone selection to furniture placement. He works directly with Hunt and Olmsted, refining plans as the structure rises. The project consumes his attention completely. He has no interest in business or politics. Building Biltmore becomes his life's work. The house is designed around specific functions. The ground floor contains public spaces, a banquet hall that can seat 64 guests, a library designed to hold 10,000 volumes, a billiard room, and multiple sitting rooms. The second floor holds family bedrooms and guest suites. The third floor contains additional guest rooms and storage. The fourth floor houses servants' quarters. Below ground, a basement level contains kitchens, mechanical systems, and that indoor swimming pool, the first of its kind in a private American residence. Technology is integrated throughout. Electric lights powered by the estate's own generator illuminate every room. Central heating systems carry steam through miles of pipes. An intercom system allows communication between floors. Elevators transport people and supplies. The house contains innovations that most American buildings won't adopt for decades. Olmsted's landscape work proceeds simultaneously. He plants hundreds of thousands of trees and shrubs, many imported from Europe and Asia. He creates a 3-mile approach road that winds through planned forests, designed to build anticipation before revealing the house, a psychological journey from wilderness to civilization. Formal gardens descend from terraces behind the residence, featuring fountains, statuary, and seasonal plantings. The farm encompasses thousands of acres with dairy operations, vegetable gardens, and livestock. The work takes 6 years. 6 years of continuous construction. 6 years of limestone blocks lifted into place. 6 years of craftsmen carving details into stone that most visitors will never notice. 6 years of systems installed, tested, refined. 6 years of trees planted that won't reach maturity for decades. Christmas Day, 1895. Biltmore officially opens. George hosts family and friends for the inaugural celebration. The house glows with electric light against winter darkness. Fires burn in enough fireplaces to heat a small village. The banquet hall serves a feast that requires days of preparation. It's a triumph. For that moment, it's everything George dreamed. But step past the showpiece rooms, and the other face appears. Behind the beauty lies infrastructure. Beneath the elegance runs machinery. Supporting the fantasy requires systems most visitors never see, people whose names rarely appear in records, costs that accumulate like compound interest. Descend into the basement. The spaces down here stretch as far as the mansion above. Boiler rooms the size of small factories burn coal, brought in by the ton. The heating system uses miles of pipes, carrying steam to radiators throughout the house. In winter, keeping Biltmore warm requires burning approximately 4 tons of coal daily. 4 tons daily. The cost of coal alone exceeds what many American families earn in a year. The electrical system runs on the estate's own power plant, a generator and infrastructure that must be maintained constantly. Wiring runs through walls and ceilings, like the nervous system of a giant organism. When something fails, electricians must troubleshoot miles of cable hidden behind stone and plaster. The kitchen operates at industrial scale. Walk-in refrigeration rooms preserve food for a household that can number over 100 people when guests arrive. Cast iron stoves large enough to roast multiple animals simultaneously. Copper pots and pans by the hundreds. A staff of cooks, assistant cooks, scullery maids, and pantry workers moving in choreographed efficiency. Service staircases narrow and unadorned allow staff to move between floors without being seen by family or guests. These passages form a parallel circulation system, hidden from the main house, designed to keep the fantasy running smoothly by rendering its operators invisible. Biltmore employs well over 100 people at peak operation. Maids, footmen, cooks, laundresses, stable, hands, gardeners, Groundskeepers, electricians, plumbers, carpenters. The invisible army required to maintain a fantasy of effortless luxury. Their names survive in payroll ledgers kept at the Biltmore Estate archives. Domenico Russo, master mason, 42, from Carrara, Italy. James Whitfield, lead carpenter, 51, trained in Edinburgh. Margaret O'Brien, head housekeeper, 37, managing a staff of 20 maids who work 12-hour days, 6 days per week. Some workers live on the estate in staff quarters, small rooms in the attic, barely heated, sparsely furnished. Others live in nearby Biltmore Village, a planned community George built to house estate workers. The village includes homes, a church, a school, all designed to the same architectural standards as the main house, creating a cohesive aesthetic environment. It looks generous. It was designed to be. But examine the economics. The average American worker in 1895 earns approximately $400 to $500 annually. Skilled craftsmen might earn $600 to $800. Estate workers at Biltmore receive wages comparable to national averages, not generous, but fair by the standards of the time. Meanwhile, monthly operating costs at Biltmore run into tens of thousands of dollars. Coal, electricity, water, staff wages, maintenance, food, supplies. The machinery of luxury consumes resources at a rate that would empty most fortunes within years. George Vanderbilt can afford it. Barely. His trust income provides approximately $150,000 to $200,000 annually, enough to cover operating costs, but not much beyond. Any major repairs, any expansions, any unexpected expenses require drawing on capital. The house was designed to last centuries, but the financial model supporting it was fragile from the beginning. Records from the estate archives show constant tension between ambition and resources. Letters between George and his financial managers discuss budget overruns, unexpected costs, difficult decisions about which projects to prioritize and which to postpone. A letter dated March 1897 from George to his estate manager. We must find economies without compromising standards. Perhaps the West Gardens can wait another season. Translation: we're running out of money. The farm operation was supposed to generate income. Olmsted's vision included scientific forestry and modern agriculture that would make Biltmore self-sufficient, even profitable. George invested heavily in dairy operations, timber management, and agricultural experimentation. The farm never made money. The investments required were too large. The markets for products were too limited. The cost of maintaining infrastructure exceeded any revenue generated. The farm became another expense, another beautiful vision that required constant subsidy. By 1900, just 5 years after Biltmore opened, George was looking for ways to reduce costs without admitting the fundamental problem. Houses at this scale cannot be sustained by even enormous fortunes if they generate no income. The mansion was designed as a residence, not a business. That decision, made at the peak of Gilded Age excess, would prove fatal to the model it represented. But for a brief window, Biltmore achieved what George dreamed. Picture Christmas of 1899, the house at its height, every room lit, every fireplace burning. Guests arriving from New York, from Philadelphia, from the social circles that defined American aristocracy at the turn of the 20th century. The approach road winds through forests, now mature enough to create the effect. Olmsted intended wilderness gradually giving way to managed landscape, building anticipation with each curve. The house appears suddenly, limestone glowing in afternoon light, towers and chimneys reaching skyward, the scale finally comprehensible only when you're standing at the base looking up. Inside, the banquet hall hosts 60 guests for Christmas dinner. The table stretches beneath that 70-foot ceiling, set with china and crystal and silver that represents months of a craftsman's wages. Courses arrive in succession: oysters, soup, fish, roasted meats, vegetables, salads, desserts, cheeses, fruits. Each dish prepared by kitchen staff working since dawn. After dinner, guests retire to the library. 10,000 volumes line the walls. George's collection of rare books and manuscripts, accumulated over years of European travel. First editions. Medieval illuminated manuscripts. Signed letters from historical figures. The library alone represents wealth beyond calculation. Conversation flows in English, French, German, the languages of educated society. Guests include artists, writers, architects, industrialists. George prefers intellectual companions to social climbers. His parties feature discussion over dancing, ideas over gossip. The house works exactly as designed. Heating keeps every room comfortable despite winter cold outside. Electric lights illuminate spaces that would have required hundreds of candles in earlier eras. Elevators transport elderly guests between floors. Bathrooms, 43 of them, feature hot running water and modern plumbing that most American homes won't have for decades. It's a demonstration of what technology and wealth can achieve. A vision of how the modern American aristocracy might live cultured, comfortable, surrounded by beauty and innovation. For that moment, it seems sustainable. But underneath the celebration, quiet pressures gather. George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898. Edith brought energy and social grace that George lacked. She transformed Biltmore from a bachelor's retreat into a proper estate capable of hosting sophisticated society. She managed the household staff, planned events, handled correspondence, performed all the invisible labor required to make a house at this scale function socially. In 1900, their daughter Cornelia was born, the only child George and Edith would have. Suddenly, Biltmore wasn't just George's dream. It was a family home, a legacy to pass forward. But how do you pass forward something that costs more to maintain than it generates? The question begins to press. George's trust income remains stable, but inflation and rising costs slowly erode its purchasing power. Property taxes, though modest by later standards, still represent substantial annual expenses. Insurance costs for a building this valuable and complex run into thousands annually. Every year requires the same spending just to maintain status quo. No growth, no expansion, just preservation. And preservation at this scale is expensive. The roof requires constant maintenance. Slate tiles damaged by weather must be replaced. Copper flashing must be repaired. Drainage systems must be kept clear. The limestone exterior needs periodic cleaning, and repair freeze-thaw cycles create cracks. Water infiltration threatens structural integrity. Windows, hundreds of them, require reglazing, painting, maintenance. The mechanical systems age. Boilers wear out. Electrical systems need updating as technology advances. Plumbing develops leaks. Elevators require replacement parts that must be custom manufactured because nothing at Biltmore is standard. Each year brings new unexpected costs. A letter from George's estate manager in 1902. The north wing roof requires immediate attention. The conservatory heating system has failed. In a single letter, nearly a quarter of George's annual income gone to maintenance. The mathematics of Biltmore are brutally simple. It costs more to maintain than any family can afford without constantly drawing down capital. And capital, once spent, doesn't regenerate. George begins making difficult decisions. Some staff positions are eliminated. Some projects are postponed indefinitely. Some planned improvements never happen. The house still functions, still hosts guests, still maintains its beauty and grandeur. But the pressure never stops building. George Vanderbilt died in March 1914, 51 years old. Complications from emergency appendectomy surgery in Washington, D.C. He never returned to Biltmore alive. His death changed everything. Edith inherited the estate, along with all its costs and complexities. Cornelia, now 14 years old, would eventually inherit from her mother. But the mathematical realities that pressured George now pressed even harder on Edith. The United States entered World War I in 1917. The war transformed American society and accelerated changes already underway. Labor costs rose sharply as workers gained leverage in tight employment markets. Material costs increased as war demands strained supply chains. Taxes began rising to fund military operations. After the war, the social world that produced Gilded Age estates underwent fundamental transformation. The Russian Revolution of 1917 terrified wealthy Americans by demonstrating that no aristocracy was permanent, no fortune was safe. Progressive taxation gained political momentum as Americans increasingly viewed extreme wealth concentration as dangerous and unjust. In 1916, the federal government introduced the estate tax, initially modest, but clearly targeting large fortunes. The idea that government could claim a portion of inherited wealth was revolutionary. For families like the Vanderbilts, it meant that each generation would lose a significant portion of capital simply through transfer. Biltmore's operating costs didn't decrease. If anything, they accelerated. But the financial model supporting them was crumbling. Edith made strategic decisions. She sold approximately 87,000 acres of Biltmore's land to the federal government in 1915, creating the core of what would become Pisgah National Forest. The sale brought much-needed capital and reduced property tax burden. But it also acknowledged reality. The estate couldn't be maintained at its original scale. The remaining property, roughly 8,000 acres, still represented enormous holdings. But the dream of a vast planned landscape was over. The 1920s brought temporary reprieve. The economy boomed. Stock market gains created new fortunes and enriched existing ones. Biltmore remained functional, even hosting paying guests in a limited capacity as Edith began experimenting with ways to generate revenue. Then came October 1929. The stock market crashed with a violence that destroyed fortunes overnight. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment soared to 25%. The Great Depression descended on America like nothing the nation had experienced since the Civil War. For families maintaining expensive estates, the Depression was catastrophic. Property values collapsed. Investment income evaporated. Meanwhile, operating costs remained constant. Coal still needed buying. Staff still needed wages. Maintenance still needed doing. Mansions across America began closing. Not dramatically, but quietly. Room by room, wing by wing. Families moved into smaller quarters and let vast spaces go dark and cold. Biltmore survived, but only through radical transformation. In 1930, Edith and Cornelia made the decision George never would have considered. They opened Biltmore to paying tourists. For $1, visitors could tour the public rooms and gardens. The private residence became a public attraction. It was admission of defeat admission that no family, no matter how wealthy, could maintain such a place as a private home. But it was also pragmatic survival. Tourist revenue didn't cover all costs, but it helped. The house remained maintained. The gardens survived. The structure itself was preserved. Cornelia married John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British diplomat. In 1924, they had 2 sons and eventually took over management of the estate. But the marriage was troubled, ending in divorce in 1934. Another cost, another complexity. Property taxes, though still relatively modest compared to what would come later, represented constant pressure. North Carolina assessed Biltmore's value at roughly $4 million in the 1930s, generating annual tax bills of approximately $40,000, nearly impossible to pay without tourism revenue. The irony was obvious. The house could only be preserved by destroying its original purpose as a private residence. World War II brought further transformation. The National Gallery of Art stored valuable artworks at Biltmore for safekeeping, fearing Axis attacks on Washington, D.C. The house became a temporary museum, safeguarding national treasures. After the war, America was different. Progressive taxation had become permanent. Estate taxes reached rates as high as 77% on large fortunes. Inheritance no longer guaranteed. Dynastic wealth government claimed its share with each generation. The economic model that made Biltmore possible inherited fortunes, large enough to sustain massive private households, was being systematically dismantled through tax policy explicitly designed to prevent extreme wealth concentration. By 1956, when Edith Vanderbilt died, Biltmore had been operating as a tourist attraction for 26 years. It was the only way to preserve it. The costs of running the estate required constant public access, constant tour groups, constant commercialization of what George had built as private sanctuary. Today, Biltmore survives as America's largest privately owned residence, still controlled by descendants of George Vanderbilt, but functioning as a commercial enterprise, not a family home. The estate welcomes roughly 1.4 million visitors annually. Admission costs approximately $75 per adult in peak season. Tourism generates estimated annual revenue exceeding $100 million. The operation employs over 2,400 people, far more than worked there in George's era. Biltmore includes a winery, multiple restaurants, a luxury hotel, event venues, and extensive retail operations. The house itself is the centerpiece, but the business model depends on diversified revenue streams. It's successful, profitable, self-sustaining, but it's not what George built. The house survives. The dream is dead. Walk through Biltmore today as a tourist, and you'll see remarkable preservation. The house looks much as it did in 1895. Rooms are furnished with original pieces. Gardens are maintained to high standards. The structure itself is sound testimony to the quality of original construction and ongoing maintenance. But you'll walk in crowds. You'll follow marked routes. You'll be asked not to touch furnishings. Velvet ropes separate you from spaces once intimate and private. Audio guides narrate facts that replace lived experience. It's a museum of wealth, a memorial to ambition, a monument to a way of life that couldn't survive contact with economic reality. Compare Biltmore's survival to what happened elsewhere. William K. Vanderbilt's marble house in Newport, Rhode Island, completed in 1892 for $11 million, was donated to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1963 after the family could no longer afford maintenance. It operates as a museum. Cornelius Vanderbilt eyes the breakers, also in Newport, completed in 1895 for similar costs to marble. House suffered the same fate. Preserved by donation to nonprofit, operating as museum, no longer family residence. These houses survived only by becoming public institutions. Most didn't survive at all. Harbor Hill, the 648-room mansion built by Clarence Mackay on Long Island, demolished in 1947 despite being only 50 years old. Too expensive to maintain, impossible to sell, worth more as salvage than as structure. Linnywood Hall, Peter Whittinger's 110-room Pennsylvania estate, abandoned, decaying, sold multiple times for fractions of original value, now probably beyond rescue. The list goes on. Dozens of Gilded Age mansions demolished or left to ruin because the economic model supporting them vanished. Biltmore survived because the Vanderbilt descendants transformed it into a business before financial pressure forced sale or demolition. The decision to commercialize painful, as it must have been saved the structure. But what was saved? The building, yes. The artifact of wealth, preserved. But the life George imagined, the purpose he designed it for, the dream of a private sanctuary sustained by inherited fortune that died decades ago. So why did billionaires stop building mansions like Biltmore? The simple answer: progressive taxation, particularly estate taxes, made it impossible to pass dynastic fortunes forward intact. But the real answer goes deeper. The social contract that allowed Gilded Age wealth accumulation was destroyed by the excesses it produced. When fortunes like the Vanderbilts exceeded government treasuries, while millions lived in poverty, political pressure for redistribution became irresistible. The estate tax introduced in 1916 and strengthened repeatedly through the mid-20th century was explicitly designed to prevent inherited aristocracy. If each generation must pay significant taxes on wealth transfer, then even enormous fortunes eventually disperse rather than concentrate. By the 1970s, estate tax rates reached 77% on fortunes above certain thresholds. No family could sustain multi-generational wealth at levels required to maintain places like Biltmore as private residences. The houses became impossible to inherit, too expensive to maintain, too costly to operate. Their value as residences fell below their cost, making them economic traps rather than assets. Modern billionaires learned the lesson. They don't build Biltmores. Instead, they buy multiple smaller properties spread across locations. Properties that generate income, commercial real estate, assets that appreciate rather than depreciate, investments hidden in trusts, offshore accounts, complex financial instruments. They learn to make wealth invisible, to structure assets to minimize tax exposure, to avoid ostentatious displays that attract political attention and public anger. Today's ultra-wealthy own estates, certainly, but nothing approaches Biltmore's scale or visibility. Jeff Bezos's multiple properties combined don't equal Biltmore's square footage. Bill Gates's Medina, Washington residence, though technologically advanced, is modest compared to Gilded Age excess. The shift isn't primarily about taste or modesty. It's about survival. Visible wealth attracts taxation. Concentrated wealth becomes target. Biltmore represents the last gasp of an era when wealth could be displayed without limit, accumulated without restraint, passed forward without government interference. George Vanderbilt built at the precise moment before that world ended. Had he waited a decade, estate taxes would have made construction impossible. Had he built a decade earlier, inheritance patterns might have allowed longer family occupation. He caught the exact window and even then, barely sustained it for his lifetime. What we've lost in the transformation from Gilded Age excess to modern wealth concealment, we've lost visibility into inequality. When fortunes build mansions, you can see wealth. You can measure it. You can photograph it, tour it, understand its scale viscerally. When fortunes hide in financial instruments, offshore accounts, and complex trusts, inequality becomes abstract. We know it exists. Numbers tell us wealth concentration today rivals or exceeds Gilded Age levels. But we can't see it, can't touch it, can't fully comprehend it. The Vanderbilts built monuments to their wealth that we can still walk through. Today's billionaires build portfolios that exist only as entries in databases. Is that progress? Or just a different form of excess, rendered invisible? Stand at Biltmore today, and you're standing in a paradox. The house survived. George's dream did not. What was built as a private sanctuary functions as a public attraction. What was designed to demonstrate refined taste and European cultural sophistication operates as a business optimizing revenue per visitor. What was meant to last centuries as family seat will likely survive centuries as museum. But survival is in preservation, not of what mattered. The building endures. The life it was designed for is extinct. This is the truth the architecture hides. Biltmore was never sustainable as originally conceived. The mathematics didn't work. The economic model was flawed from groundbreaking. George Vanderbilt, brilliant, cultured, sophisticated, built a monument to a dream that couldn't survive contact with reality. The house required constant subsidy. The estate needed endless capital infusion. The fantasy demanded invisible labor, hidden costs, continuous sacrifice from people whose names we barely remember. Domenico Russo, the mason from Carrara, who carved stone details most visitors never notice. What became of him? Did he die wealthy from his work on Biltmore? Or did he die like most craftsmen, with skills that enriched others but left him little? Margaret O'Brien, head housekeeper, managing 20 maids through 12-hour days, did she ever own a home of her own? Or did she spend her life maintaining someone else's palace? The workers who made Biltmore possible remain largely anonymous. Their labor created beauty that endures. Their names survive in fragments, payroll ledgers, census records, occasional newspaper mentions. They paid the real cost, not with money, with time, with bodies wearing out, with futures circumscribed by service divisions they didn't share in. And what of George Vanderbilt himself? He achieved something remarkable. He created beauty that draws millions of visitors annually, more than a century later. He demonstrated what human craftsmanship and ambition could accomplish at the pinnacle of American wealth. But he died at 51, perhaps worn down by the pressure of maintaining his creation. He never saw his daughter grow up. He never witnessed Biltmore's transformation into tourist attraction. He died believing or hoping that his dream could continue. It couldn't. The question isn't whether billionaires could build another Biltmore. Of course they could. Modern wealth concentration easily exceeds what the Vanderbilts commanded. Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk could fund multiple Biltmores without significantly affecting their net worth. The question is whether they would. The answer is no. Because they learned what the Vanderbilts discovered too late. Visible wealth attracts consequences. Ostentatious display invites taxation. Monuments to excess generate political pressure for redistribution. Better to stay invisible. Better to hide wealth in complexity. Better to live comfortably in multiple modest properties than conspicuously in one impossible-to-defend palace. The transformation isn't moral progress. It's strategic adaptation. Wealth didn't disappear. It learned camouflage. Biltmore stands as the last monument to an era of visible inequality. It survives only because it transformed into something its creator never intended, a business, a museum, a memorial to dead dreams. Walk through Biltmore as a tourist, and you'll see craftsmanship, beauty, ambition made tangible. You'll hear stories of wealth beyond comprehension, of life lived at scales most people can't imagine. But look closer. Stand in the basement and imagine 4 tons of coal burning daily. Stand in the service corridors and picture servants moving unseen to maintain the illusion. Stand in the library and calculate how many workers' annual wages equal the value of books they'd never have time to read. Stand there long enough and the beauty stops hiding the cost. This is why Biltmore matters. Not because it's beautiful, though it is. Not because it's historically significant, though it is. But because it reveals a truth about wealth and power that modern inequality conceals. The palace requires the basement. The beauty demands invisible labor. The dream costs more than anyone willingly admits. George Vanderbilt built something magnificent. And he built something impossible. Both truths exist simultaneously. We can admire the achievement while acknowledging its unsustainability. We can appreciate the beauty while counting the cost. The house survived because it stopped being a house. The dream died because dreams at this scale always do. And the billionaires learned the lesson. If you want to keep your fortune, never build a monument that lets everyone see exactly how large it is. Biltmore stands alone, the last of its kind, preserved in amber, beautiful and dead. A palace that reveals, through its very survival, why no one will ever build such a thing again. Not because they can't, because they learned not to.